Jimmy Kimmel walked into a room full of powerful people, pointed at the most powerful one, and spent an entire evening making him look ridiculous. And reportedly, by the time it was over, somewhere in Mar-a-Lago, a television was being muted, unmuted, and muted again with the specific fury of a man who has spent decades mastering cameras, but has never fully figured out how to survive a punchline delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right audience. This is the story of one roast, why it hit harder than a week of cable news debates, and why the reaction to it ended up being funnier than half the jokes themselves. Start with the setup, because context is everything, and this one was unusual from the beginning. The White House Correspondents' Dinner has always been a strange event. It is a formal gathering where journalists in tuxedos sit in the same room as the politicians they cover. Everybody pretends the arrangement is normal, and a comedian tries to make a room full of powerful, uncomfortable people laugh at things none of them actually find funny. The tension is supposed to be the point. The tradition is built on the idea that power should occasionally be forced to sit still while someone mocks it to its face in a public setting with cameras running and no escape available. This year, the official comedy was scrapped. Instead of a comedian, the event brought in a mentalist. That decision, whatever the reasoning behind it, sent a specific signal that Kimmel immediately understood. The room had decided that the traditional roast was more trouble than it was worth. So Kimmel created his own version and performed it on his own stage, on his own schedule, with his own rules and absolutely no obligation to distribute the discomfort evenly across party lines. He showed up with sarcasm loaded and aimed, and he did not pretend otherwise for a single minute. What followed was the kind of evening that generates clips traveling at speeds that no carefully managed press release can match. The opening joke set the tone with a precision that required no warm-up. The president had reportedly not wanted him to make jokes about him tonight, Kimmel noted, but had also not arranged the $130,000 to $30,000 payment that would have been required to ensure silence. The reference was direct, specific, and required no explanation from anyone who had been paying even minimal attention to American news for the previous 2 years. The hush money case, the 34 felony convictions, the documented payments to Stormy Daniels that formed the factual core of a Manhattan trial that ended with a unanimous jury verdict. Kimmel did not need to build to this or frame it carefully. He dropped it in the first 30 seconds and let it land in the specific way that a joke lands when everybody in the room already knows the underlying fact and has been waiting for someone to name it out loud without apology. Then came the makeup line. Kraft singles. This one worked differently from the legal reference because it operated in the register of pure image rather than documented fact. The Kraft singles comparison produced an immediate visual that, once your brain accepted it, became very difficult to remove. That is the specific gift of the most effective roast comedy. It does not argue with you. It does not present evidence and ask you to evaluate it. It places an image in your mind and lets the image do its work independently long after the joke itself has ended. You can disagree with a political argument. You cannot unthink a specific visual once it has attached itself to a face you see regularly on television. Kimmel understood this distinction and used it with intention throughout the evening. From there, the roast expanded outward in concentric rings, each one touching a different part of the broader Trump universe with varying degrees of sharpness. The Spirit Airlines segment was one of those pieces of political comedy that works best when the underlying reality is already strange enough that the comedian barely needs to add anything. Reports that the administration was seriously exploring a government stake of up to 90% in Spirit Airlines, an airline whose entire public identity is built around discount prices, cramped seats, and the specific misery of travelers who have exhausted every better option, generated genuine confusion about what the strategic logic was supposed to be. Kimmel treated it exactly as it deserved, as a premise that sounds like a joke before the comedian has touched it, requiring only a minimal push to become actual comedy. If the country is in the business of acquiring questionable brands, why stop at one airline? The haunted motel, the collapsing smoothie stand. Once the logic is established, the list writes itself. This is one of the structural advantages Kimmel operates with in the current political era. The material keeps arriving pre-seasoned. A significant portion of his job involves identifying the absurdity already present in the news rather than manufacturing absurdity from thin air. The comedian's role shifts from inventor to curator, selecting the most comedically potent items from an enormous daily supply and presenting them with the timing and framing that maximizes their impact. Then came the Epstein material, which is where the room shifted from pure entertainment into something heavier and considerably more consequential. The Maxwell USB drive situation, specifically the mysterious delivery of a drive from Ghislaine Maxwell to a Trump-appointed DOJ official, arriving approximately 1 week after Melania Trump's surprise independent press conference addressing her Epstein connections, created the specific kind of story that political comedy is almost obligated to address. Not because the comedian knows what is on the drive, or what the full situation ultimately means, but because the visible behavior surrounding the situation produces exactly the atmosphere that makes audiences assume the worst. The secrecy, the strange handling, the reluctance to answer direct questions, the timing that raises obvious questions. Kimmel leaned into the ridiculousness of an administration that sometimes handles sensitive materials, like a family guarding a locked garage. Nobody knows what is inside, but the way they are guarding it is doing more damage than transparency ever would. He did not need to make accusations. He needed only to describe the visible behavior accurately and let the audience supply their own conclusions, which audiences are extremely capable of doing when the visible behavior is as strange as it currently appears to be. This is one of the consistent dynamics of political scandal in the modern era. The management of the story often produces more damage than the story itself would have if handled transparently from the beginning. The instinct toward secrecy, toward aggressive denial, toward attacking the credibility of people asking questions rather than answering them, creates a vacuum that fills immediately with the worst available assumptions. Comedy accelerates this process because it frames the secrecy itself as confirmation, which it frequently is. Melania's documentary came next. The specific comedy of political documentaries lies in the gap between the soft piano music and slow-motion cinematic presentation and the actual events being elegantly repackaged by that presentation. Months of drama, scandals, headlines, feuds, and non-stop controversy can be wrapped in enough artistic lighting to temporarily resemble an inspiring story of resilience and vision. Kimmel treated the polished image exactly as it is, which is branding applied to a story that has enough raw material to sustain several competing documentaries with entirely different conclusions about the same events. The lighting does not change the timeline. The piano music does not rewrite the documented record. Audiences who remember the actual storyline are not confused by the cinematic version. They are amused by it. J.D. Vance got tossed into the roast machine with the characterization of someone who RSVPs to public appearances with the energy of a person who scheduled something they immediately regretted and has been looking for a legitimate excuse to cancel ever since. Every administration has at least one figure who campaigns like a fearless warrior but socializes like someone trying to avoid a group presentation. The caricature is effective precisely because it captures something publicly visible. Vance's selective enthusiasm for certain public engagements over others has been noticed and documented across enough news cycles that the joke requires no additional setup. Stephen Miller received the treatment reserved for figures who appear to operate on the principle that if a policy approach is not harsh enough, the solution is to make it harsher. Some political operatives speak as though every national challenge can be solved by adding more severity and removing more human consideration. Miller gets cast in this role consistently across media coverage from multiple ideological perspectives, which suggests the characterization is reaching across the usual partisan filters. Kimmel took the publicly available portrait and amplified it to its comedic conclusion. Kash Patel drew the comparison to the confident renovator who has assembled everything incorrectly, but continues to insist that the chaos is proceeding exactly according to plan. Pete Hegseth was framed as the kind of ally whose presence raises the ambient concern level of any room he enters, rather than reducing it. These are sketch comedy portraits built from something publicly visible in each person's documented behavior. Political caricature works this way. It identifies one dominant quality, amplifies it to a memorable extreme, and releases it back into the culture where it attaches to the person and becomes difficult to separate from them. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. occupies a genuinely unusual space in the current political landscape, and Kimmel treated that space as the comedy goldmine it actually is. The unpredictability is the joke. Every public statement arrives from a direction that nobody could have predicted from the previous one. Every headline feels generated by spinning 3 random wheels and combining the results. The audience does not need a specific punchline about a specific statement because the general atmosphere around his public presence provides the entire setup independently. The Trump Son segment had the specific energy of comedy, targeting people who have built public personas as extensions of their father's brand while simultaneously attempting to establish independent identities. This is an inherently difficult combination to execute and an inherently rich target for satire. Eric entered the boardroom at some point and simply stayed because nobody wanted to explain why he should leave, which is the kind of characterization that sounds exaggerated until you try to identify the specific evidence that would contradict it. Don Jr. operates at a consistent energy level, suggesting every morning involves both significant caffeine and a freshly loaded list of grievances requiring immediate public expression. The dynamic between them, the constant visibility, the matching suits, the particular way they embody nepotism in designer packaging gives comedians a setup that practically generates its own punchline. The energy policy segment was where comedy became something slightly sharper than pure entertainment, and the breaking wind, passing gas line was the moment that compressed months of dramatic policy announcements into their most digestible form. Trump's approach to energy messaging has a specific quality worth identifying directly. Every policy becomes a heroic narrative. Every decision becomes destiny. Drilling is not an economic choice. It is civilization's foundation. Opposing wind power is not a regulatory preference. It is a form of patriotism whose internal logic has never been fully articulated but is delivered with absolute conviction. Energy production is not an industry sector. It is the beating heart of national identity. Kimmel ripped into that dramatic framing by reminding everyone that just because something is branded loudly does not mean it is actually working. This is one of Trump's most consistent political techniques, selling every policy like a monster truck rally, with maximum theatrical energy, regardless of whether the underlying substance warrants it. Whether the policy works, fails, backfires, or quietly disappears from the official agenda 6 weeks after its announcement with no explanation, almost feels secondary to the performance of confidence surrounding it. Kimmel's message was that when politics becomes entertainment, comedians naturally become the most credible critics because they are operating in the same register. The Epstein callback, specifically the line about Trump having come a long way from 30 years ago when he was just another rich guy in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit, landed with the specific weight of a joke that does not require exaggeration because the documented relationship is already more than sufficient. Trump and Epstein's documented social history, including the now famous 1992 video of them together at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's own description of Epstein as a terrific guy who liked women on the younger side, and the subsequent handling of Epstein-related files and figures by the current administration provides enough material that the comedian's job is simply to point clearly rather than embellish. The satirical Burger King of Comedy Gold Award at the end was the kind of absurdist conclusion that only works when everything preceding it has established why it is warranted, and everything preceding it had. Trump generates comedy at a rate and volume that is genuinely unprecedented in American political history. He dominates news cycles, creates feuds, makes promises with specific numbers attached that are verifiable and frequently wrong, announces initiatives that quietly disappear, and responds to every challenge with the emotional register of someone who has never fully processed the difference between fighting a business competitor and governing a country. Most presidents leave behind libraries, policy legacies, and legislative records. Trump is already leaving behind an archive of material that will sustain comedians for decades and possibly longer. The award named this dynamic explicitly and accurately. It also named something that Trump himself has never fully reckoned with. He inspires the comedy not despite his political success, but partly because of it. The qualities that make him an effective political figure, the domination of attention, the willingness to say things that others won't, the shamelessness about reversing positions, the constant performance of winning regardless of outcomes, are the same qualities that make him an endless supply chain for comedic material. He cannot separate them. They are the same thing. The reported reaction afterward followed the pattern that anyone who has watched Trump respond to comedy for the past decade could have predicted precisely. Trump has never developed the capacity to absorb mockery and move past it. His entire public identity depends on the projection of dominance, and satire is the one form of attack that dominance cannot defend against effectively. You can fight opponents, you can dismiss critics, you can ignore journalists, you can attack fact-checkers, but a joke that makes you look ridiculous cannot be defeated by being angrier about it, because anger at a joke joke confirms that the joke landed, which confirms the comedian's diagnosis, which produces more jokes, which generates more anger, which produces more material. This is the trap that has defined the Trump comedy relationship since the very beginning, and it is one he has never found his way out of. The strategic response to an effective roast from someone you cannot easily categorize as a partisan enemy is the response that almost no politician who relies on dominance can bring themselves to execute, which is genuine indifference. Not performed indifference, but actual disengagement. Let the story die of natural causes by refusing to give it a second act. Instead, Trump went on Truth Social. He called Kimmel a man with no talent. He referenced ratings. He suggested the network should remove him. Each of these responses extended the story's life by days and sent millions of people searching for the clips who had not seen them during the original broadcast. The complaint became distribution. The fury became free marketing. The presidential outrage became the second act that transformed a single night's comedy segment into a multi-week conversation. Kimmel almost certainly treated any reported fury as confirmation that the evening had done exactly what it was designed to do. This is not cynical on his part. It is simply an accurate reading of how the attention economy functions in the current media environment. When powerful people complain loudly about a joke, they are performing a service to the comedian that no publicity budget could replicate. There is a broader point here about what political comedy actually does and why it matters in a way that goes beyond entertainment. Research has consistently shown that people who consume political satire are more likely to engage civically, attend political events, discuss issues, and vote than viewers of traditional news content. This is counterintuitive because satire is often dismissed as preaching to the choir, as making people who already agree with the comedian feel good about what they already believe without changing any minds that matter. That criticism has merit in specific contexts, but it misses something important about what effective political satire accomplishes beyond persuasion. It names things. It gives language and image to experiences and dynamics that people are living through but struggling to articulate. When Kimmel describes the gap between Trump's policy announcements and their actual outcomes, he is not teaching anyone a new fact. He is providing a frame that makes the accumulated experience of watching those gaps appear over and over again comprehensible and shareable. People do not share political comedy because it changes their mind. They share it because it names something they already know in a way they could not have said themselves. The Kraft Singles image, the breaking wind and passing gas policy legacy, the Burger King of Comedy Gold Award. These are not arguments, they are compression. They take months of observation and experience and compress it into a single memorable image that travels instantly across every platform and demographic, arriving in the feeds and conversations of people who would never sit through a cable news panel or read a policy analysis. That is the function that no amount of official communication can perform, and it is the function that makes Trump furious in a way that substantive policy criticism rarely manages to. By the time Kimmel described the event as a celebration of the hottest country under Trump's leadership, which was clearly a jab at political tension, social division, economic stress, media warfare, and that persistent national feeling of having been stress-sweating continuously for the better part of a decade, the roast had accomplished everything it set out to do and more. It held up a mirror. It named the absurdity. It gave millions of people a shared language for experiences they had been carrying individually. It reminded everyone watching that power, no matter how loudly it projects itself, has never successfully survived a truly accurate description delivered with perfect timing. Kimmel knows that. He has known it for 20 years of doing this work. He knows that Trump is simultaneously the most exhausting subject and the most renewable energy source in the history of American political comedy. Every brag becomes a setup. Every feud becomes content. Every exaggerated promise becomes a callback, waiting for its moment. Every fury-driven social media post at 1 a.m. becomes the opening line of tomorrow's monologue. Trump understands cameras better than almost anyone who has ever been in public life. He knows how to fill them, how to command them, how to make them come to him. But comedians understand something that cameras alone cannot capture. They understand that the same lens that projects power can, in the right hands and at the right moment, make power look small, exposed, and slightly ridiculous. Jimmy Kimmel spent one evening demonstrating exactly how that works. The television in Mar-a-Lago was still being muted. The clips were still spreading. The next round of material was already writing itself. And somewhere in a late-night writer's room, somebody had just opened a fresh document and typed a single word at the top: Trump.